Lecture 6A, Introduction. The ancient Romans and their civilization continue to fascinate the Western world to this day. The study of Roman civilization has a lot to teach us Americans to this very day. The chances are that you're not quite as fascinated with the ancient Romans as I've been, but then not everybody winds up growing up to be a professor of classics. For purposes of this class, I urge you to keep feeling fascination as best you can. In segment 6B, Why Rome?, we will encounter some of the reasons for history's fascination with the ancient Romans. Sure, there were gladiators and orgies and crucifixions and gladiators and more gladiators and all the other good stuff you see in the movies. But we'll be looking at a few of the Romans' lesser-known pastimes. History buffs have traditionally looked to the Roman experience for enlightenment and useful parallels. Kings and queens and wannabe superpowers have looked up to the Roman Empire as some sort of role model. The Romans are the first nation in Western history to have appointed themselves as the world's policeman. Finally, the fall of the Roman Empire, whenever and wherever it fell, is considered the prime example of how not to run an empire. Segment 6C, Podunk on the Tiber, examines the Romans' oldest myths about their city's foundation. In the process, we dredge up a few stray kernels of historical fact. The city was founded by a dude by the name of Romulus, who celebrated the moment by killing his twin brother Remus, hence the name Rome instead of Rheims. Unless, of course, you're Russian, in which case the name of the city is, in fact, Rheims. From that point on, the Romans showed a talent for getting into civil wars. Romulus built the city's population by recruiting refugees and other riffraff, and the men in turn had to steal wives from neighboring cities. If you're familiar with Australian culture, which prides itself on Australia's beginnings as a prison colony, you know that these things still happen. But once Rome had become more powerful, a more attractive foundation myth was cooked up. It was merged in with the old one. But myth can hide things too. And one thing the Romans seem most concerned to hide is Rome's history with the Etruscan kings. In segment 6D, A Farewell to Kings, we sift myths and legends of the Roman monarchy for even more exciting kernels of historical fact. There were warlike kings and peaceful kings, Roman kings and Etruscan kings, nice kings and mean kings. It reads more like a soap opera than anything else. The same is true of the dramatic Rape of Lucretia, which supposedly motivated the manly Roman Brutus to depose the hated Etruscan king Tarquin the Proud. Even though we can safely say that these things did not exactly happen in that way. It's worth keeping in mind that the Romans themselves considered these stories true and considered them important. So we got to learn them anyway. Segment 6B, Why Rome? The influence of Rome can be felt around America to this very day. Just start with our government. Our nation's founders were very well read in Greek and Roman classical literature, and particularly in their political thought. While the Greeks undoubtedly established democratic traditions way before the Romans did, the Romans actually made democracy work on a consistent basis. Our founders recognized this Roman tradition when they claimed America's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They recognized it even further when they invented the American government. The senior house of the United States legislature is named the Senate, the same as the Romans' senior legislative body. The chief executive of the United States is the president, a term derived from the Latin verb praesitio, which means to sit at the front. The chief executive of every state is the governor. This is derived from the Latin noun gubernator, which is itself derived from the Greek noun kubernetes, or steersman. The democratic ideals developed, even if they were not always actually practiced, by the Romans and ancient Greeks, form the basis of American citizenship to this day. Questions of cultural influence aside, it's not hard to see a common bond between ancient Romans and modern Americans. From ancient Roman literature, primarily poetry, we know that the Romans enjoyed the ancient form of situation comedies, that they were very fond of violent contact sports, and that they took great pride in their nation's military achievements. Archaeology teaches us that the ancient Romans built roads and buildings everywhere and built them to last, and that they were very fond of a sauce called garum, made from the squeezings of rancid fish guts. Wherever you find Roman settlements, you will find busted up jars of garum. The ancient Romans, like us, were very skeptical of their politicians, and later on they were skeptical of their emperors. That did not, however, keep Roman politics from being a blood sport, complete with rioting in the streets. No matter how downtrodden the Roman lower classes might be, a Roman politician or Roman emperor who didn't take the people seriously often came to a bad end. On the one hand, the ancient Romans were fixated on the importance of upholding their glorious national traditions, the so-called mos maiorum, or ways of the ancestors. Consider this a warning. I will use the term mos maiorum over and over again this semester. On the other hand, the ancient Romans were almost always quite tolerant of new peoples and new ways, and even of new religions, provided these new religions didn't offend the mos maiorum. Look, I said it again, too much. Rome's 2 millennia of growth, decline, and fall have fascinated historians to this very day. Over its more than 2,000 years of existence, Rome passed from near utter insignificance to a regional power, from a regional power to a world power, and from a world power to the most powerful nation of its day, perhaps of any time. Upon becoming the most powerful nation of its day, internal distress in the time of Christ forced Rome to change from democracy to something called the Principate, monarchy wrapped up in the package of a democracy. For nearly 2 centuries, this new Roman Principate maintained Rome's status as the world's only superpower, until internal and external pressures began to tear Rome apart again. The so-called decline and fall of Rome, a concept popularized by Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon, has been held up as a warning for civilizations for the last 300 years. To this day, right here in Springfield, Missouri's own local newspaper, you can read letters citing the fall of the Roman Empire to predict America's future fall due to any one of a wide range of flaws: militarism, immorality, apathy, male pattern baldness, or even overtaxation. From the very beginning, we Americans have been fixated on overtaxation. The ancient Roman style of running an empire has also fascinated monarchs and other empire builders to this very day. After the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, or some other year, the kings of the so-called Holy Roman Empire, 962 to 1806 AD, routinely referred to themselves as Kaiser, the German form of the name Caesar. Farther east, the people of the so-called Byzantine Empire would deny that they had ever stopped being Romans, even though the Byzantines would tell you this not in Latin, but an ancient Greek. The Byzantines even insisted on being called Romaioi, which is the ancient Greek word for Romans. After the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, Grand Prince Ivan III of Muscovy, we'll meet him later, married a princess of Byzantine royal blood and began using the title Tsar, a Russian form of the name Caesar. In 1721, Ivan's successor, Tsar Peter I the Great, began using the term Imperator. When the German Empire reunified under the Hohenzollerns in 1871, a fact about which I will never make mention again, its rulers once more claimed the title Kaiser. To this day, British coinage contains the Latin phrase Elizabeth II, or Elisabetta Secunda, Dei gratia regina. Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen of England. Whoever said that Latin was dead needs to get out a little bit more. But most fascinating of all to your instructor, the deluxe yours truly, is the idea of one nation assigning itself an imperial mission of maintaining world peace. The Romans accomplished this first with the Pax Romana, also known as the Pax Augusta, which lasted from just before the time of Christ well into the 2nd century A.D. Russia dreamed of bringing about a Pax Rustica and accomplished it for a while. Britain tried to impose a Pax Britannica. You and I live in the times of a Pax Americana, with consequences affecting every American in every part of his or her life. The ultimate purpose of this course is to make you decide whether a Pax Americana is worth the work, worth the sacrifice, or not. And in order to answer that question intelligently, we have to start with the ancient Romans. Segment 6C, Podunk on the Tiber. Early on the morning of April 21st, 753 BC, two young brothers named Romulus and Remus climbed to a hill in Latium, a region in what is now west-central Italy. They'd already experienced a very interesting life. Twin sons of a local princess and the great god Mars, they'd been exposed at birth by their evil granduncle and left to die. Luckily, a roaming she-wolf found the bawling babies, and instead of eating them, she suckled them. This saved them until a friendly local shepherd and his wife discovered them and brought them up as their own. After a troubled adolescence, young Romulus and Remus decided on a new start. That's how the twins found themselves on top of a hill in Latium, founding a new city on the site of what would eventually be Rome. Problem is, only one of them could become king. One of them had to have been the older twin, but they were mere babies at the time they were born, and they really couldn't be expected to notice who was first. Instead, like the future Romans they resorted to augury, the art of bird signs, to decide who was the proper king. Remus was the first to spot a flock of vultures, 6 of them. But then Romulus saw 12 vultures, so he won. Another version of this story says that Remus jumped over a wall that Romulus had just finished building. Both versions end with Remus dead and Romulus sole ruler of the city they had just founded. Romulus recruited new settlers for his city, which was known as Rome, and not Rheims unless you're Russian. The Russians do call the city Rheims, by opening an asylum in the forest, where fugitives, freedmen, and slaves could join this new Roman people. Since Rome was still experiencing a shortage of marriage-aged females, Romulus invited the neighboring Sabine tribe over for a little picnic. While the Sabine men were busy enjoying the food and the drink, the Romans ran off with the Sabine women. The Sabine army went back for their weapons. They marched on Rome to bring their women back, but the women, so the story goes, were just as happy to be Romans. They said, "Guys, go home. It's all good." At any rate, that's how the ancient Romans liked to think their city was founded. The name Romulus means young Roman in Latin, and his character was almost certainly a legendary invention. The murder of Remus, murdering your own brother, is a tough one to explain positively. The Latin word for she-wolf is lupa, and it is also a word meaning prostitute. No doubt, a struggling young city-state was always looking to pad its population by welcoming fugitives and stealing wives. This account of Rome's foundation became even less satisfactory as Rome became stronger and came into contact with Greek colonies which were scattered all along the southern Italian coast. Almost every one of these Greek colonies could brag about being founded by a hero, or founded by the son of the gods, or at least founded by a big-time hero from the Trojan War. Suddenly, the murderous foster son of a canine or a prostitute, whichever you pick, wasn't much to brag about. By the 300s BC, the Romans had latched on to a legend about the hero Aeneas, illegitimate son of the love goddess Venus, and one of the Trojan army's greatest fighters. After Troy was sacked, Aeneas had wandered the Mediterranean, finally winding up in Italy, where he founded a few cities and was worshipped as a god after he died. The Romans, quote-unquote, discovered that Aeneas had been a distant ancestor of Romulus, which not only made the Romulus myth sound better, but it made Rome's founder a direct descendant of an ancient Greek goddess. Woot. Historically, Rome started out as one of roughly 50 villages in Latium, again, a region in the west-central area of what is now Italy. Rome had an advantageous location. The original settlements, which eventually merged to form Rome, existed on 7 little hills: Capitoline, Caelian, Aventine, Palatine, Quirinal, Viminal, Oppian, I just named them so I can say I named them, surrounding a nasty little swamp right in the middle. This same cluster of hills also overlooked the crossing of the Tiber River, offering the little settlements both water and land transportation. Once the sewer was built to drain the swamp in the middle, the Romans had a forum, and they were ready to have a great city. The 1st century BC historian Livy recognized Rome's advantageous location. He places these words into a speech by the general Camillus, who was bane of the Etruscans and who had saved Rome from the Gauls. And here's what Camillus says: "Not without reason did gods and men choose this spot for the site of our city. The healthful hills, the river to bring us produce from the inland regions, and oversea commerce from abroad. The sea itself, near enough to be convenient, but not yet so near to bring danger from foreign fleets. Our location, right in the heart of Italy. All these advantages make this the best place of all places in the world for a city destined to grow great." Livy's account comes at the tail of some very interesting developments in Rome. Rome had already established herself as the leading city in the region of Latium, and was now fighting it out with various Etruscan cities to the north. As we will see, it took a great deal of time and effort for the Romans to make themselves masters of Italy. And their biggest immediate threat was posed by the same funky people known as the Etruscans. Where the Etruscans came from, not even the Etruscans themselves knew for sure. They were already established on the Italian peninsula by 800 BC, and they lived in fortified city-states, each pretty independent, protected by a strong military. The Etruscans were way ahead of the village-dwelling Latins, and I include the Romans here. They were way ahead of the Latins culturally and scientifically. The Etruscans dominated huge parts of central Italy, again including Latium and Rome, until the end of the 500s BC. The Etruscans were influenced to at least some extent by the ancient Greeks, many of whom had colonized southern Italy. The Etruscans proved to be the single most extensive influence on Roman society. Thanks to the Etruscans, the Romans worshipped a group of anthropomorphic deities, that is to say, gods and goddesses who looked, thought, and behaved like mortal men and mortal women. Like the Etruscans, the Romans believed in all sorts of fortune tellers, developed their own very funky artistic traditions, and wrote with this thing called an alphabet, which they had gotten from the ancient Greeks. But the early relationship between Romans and Etruscans was very seldom friendly. Since the Etruscans were by far the more advanced culture, the Etruscans dominated the Romans in Latium and probably ruled Rome for quite some time. It is even thought that the Etruscan kings had drained the swamp between the hills of Rome and built the Roman Forum, because, left to their own devices, the Romans themselves never would have accomplished such a feat of engineering. Not that the Romans were particularly grateful. The general Camillus, who just delivered that cute speech about Rome's location, was just one of a number of Roman generals who won eternal glory by kicking Etruscan tail. Likewise, the fall of the Roman monarchy in 509 BC probably related more to hatred of Etruscans than it did to hatred of monarchy. And while we're at it, let's take a look at that good old Roman monarchy. Segment 6D, A Farewell to Kings. As Roman legend has it, the Roman monarchy lasted from 753 BC to 509 BC. The traditional list of Roman kings goes like this: 753 to 716, Romulus, the founder. 715 to 674 BC, Numa Pompilius, who founded the Roman religion and married a nymph by the name of Egeria. 673 to 642, Tullius Hostilius, who destroyed the neighboring city of Alba Longa. 642 to 617, Ancus Marcius. 616 to 579, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the Etruscan, who supposedly drained the Forum swamp. 578 to 535, Servius Tullius, the wall builder, who was a native-born Roman. And finally, 535 to 509, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Haughty, an Etruscan who built the Capitoline Temple. If you count the year 509 BC toward the monarchy, it lasted for 245 years, giving each of the 7 kings an average reign of 35 years. Neat, huh? There's also a cute pattern in which the odd-numbered kings were warlike and the even-numbered kings were peace-loving. Cute. Finally, the two Tarquin kings are Etruscans, with a Roman, Servius Tullius, wedged in between them. Clearly, there is a lot of literary invention going on here. But despite that, there are also kernels of historical fact that need to be observed. Numa Pompilius, for example, the second king, is said to have received instructions for Roman religious practices by consulting with his wife, a nymph named Egeria. Numa's legend sets up the close relationship between Roman religion and the Roman state. Tullius the Hostile was in fact a surly dude who earned his name by wiping out neighboring towns to the ground. And then we have the two Tarquins, Lucius Tarquinius the Old and his son Lucius Tarquinius the Proud. The story of their reigns offers little, if any, historical fact about Roman-Etruscan relations in the 500s BC. But it does paint the Etruscans as imperialist jerks compared with the simple and noble Romans. Lucumo, his original name, was an Etruscan refugee from the city Tarquinii. He came to Rome with his wife Tanaquil and took the name Lucius Tarquinius, Lucius from Tarquinii. He got close to King Ancus Marcius and convinced the Romans that he, Lucius Tarquinius, should become the next king, and not the sons of Ancus Marcius. During Tarquinius Priscus's reign, that is, Tarquin the Old's reign, Rome fought many victorious wars, was enriched by much land and much plunder. His great public works included the Great Sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, which drained the Forum, and he's thought to have begun the Temple of Capitoline Jupiter. To the Romans, this was all very good, but Tarquin was assassinated after 38 years by the sons of Ancus Marcius. That's an awful long time to wait to settle a grudge. Instead of the Marcius brothers taking over, King Servius Tullius ruled for many years, until he was displaced by Tarquin the Proud, son of Tarquin the Old. Keeping in mind that this account is almost totally fictional, the kernel of historical fact is important. The Etruscans were calling the shots, and the native Romans didn't like it much. Not that Tarquin the Proud was any sweetheart. His first official act as king was to drive his chariot over the body of his predecessor, Servius Tullius. Tarquin the Proud murdered the most influential members of the Senate, even though it was a merely advisory body, and he turned the lower classes into his personal labor army so that he could finish his dad's temple to Capitoline Jupiter. It looked like Rome was descending from monarchy into downright tyranny. Then Tarquin's son Sextus raped a Roman woman by the name of Lucretia. Even though Lucretia's menfolk argued with her that she herself had done nothing wrong to merit such an attack, Lucretia set what Roman women considered a precedent by killing herself. Roman men were pretty tough, but the women tended to be tougher. To avenge Lucretia, some Roman men under the leadership of one Lucius Junius Brutus, or Junius the Dumb, effectively drove Tarquin the Proud and his supporters out of Rome for good. They also supposedly replaced the monarchy with a republic. The year this all supposedly happened was 509 BC. It might as well have been 509 BC. We'll never know. The Romans' constitution, as supposedly constructed in 509 BC, I hope you've got that date down, was never written down in so many words. But there's no doubt it was intended to prevent any future Roman kings. One major principle of the Roman constitution was annuality. Annuality means that a new group of magistrates, that's the name for Roman elected officials, would be elected every year. Each magistrate had a term of exactly 1 year. If a magistrate wanted to hold an office for more than 1 year, he would have to go through the election process again. And the Roman electorate was traditionally a tough sell. They didn't want any more kings. Another major principle was collegiality. Collegiality meant that power, especially the imperium, the power to command obedience, had to be shared at all times. The annual magistracies were always held by at least 2 men at the same time, with each man having equal powers. This again was a direct reaction to the excesses of the monarchy. No one annual magistrate could possibly gather enough power to make himself a king. In the very beginning, the highest elected magistrates were 2 praetors, but the praetors were passed up by 2 consuls. Each consul basically possessed the same amount of imperium as the king had possessed. The one and only exception to this policy of collegiality was the office of dictator, awarded only in times of dire emergency to 1 man. And this 1 man could only be a dictator for 6 months. Then he had to stop. The king's religious functions were also shuffled off to various priesthoods, overseen by an elected Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest. Although these policies of annuality and collegiality stayed off monarchy for centuries, they tended to hinder the consistent policies necessary for stable government. This consistency was instead supplied by the Roman Senate. Previously, a body of old upper-class patricians who had given the king advice, the Senate developed into ancient Rome's senior legislative body. While the Senate's opinions never officially held the force of law, the magistrates regarded them as binding anyway. And here's why. The magistrates themselves were all members of the Senate. They would serve their year as a magistrate and come right back to the Senate. If they did not obey the Senate during their 1 year in office, they would be shut out for good once they returned to the Senate. They might as well not show up. However, since the patricians, the upper class, all tended to share the same values in these days, consistency was maintained pretty much from the beginning of the Roman Republic. Whether this consistency was always a positive thing, well, that was something completely different.
Segment 6E, Conclusions. 1. Rome is still important. The people are still fascinating. The history is still instructive. The legacy is still all around you and all around everyone else in the Western world. Like it or not, the United States of America has assumed Rome's old roles as the world's tough guy and the world's policeman. In the words of the great scholar Wilt Chamberlain, nobody roots for Goliath. Like the United States, Rome rules from very humble beginnings to become the one superpower of their day. Because the Romans learned how to rule their empire well and did so for centuries, they were genuinely appreciated for their contributions to world peace. But once times began to get rough internally, and once the barbarians started crashing the gates, the Pax Romana disintegrated.
Then Rome became a lot less popular. Then Goliath started to stagger. Then Rome found herself all alone. Then the Western Roman Empire fell apart. The same thing happened to the Eastern Roman Empire. Does this sound familiar? I hope we never have to learn. Number 2, who knew? Looking at Rome's beginnings, even in hindsight, it would be hard to recognize a nation destined to dominate the world. As one of just 40 or 50 podunk towns in the region of Latium, Rome would have been lucky to wind up ruling the Latin League. As Camillus, the famous general, observed, Rome's location was perhaps a little bit better, in that Rome was built on hills overlooking a ford of the Tiber. But Rome's great advantage was really the Roman people. Tough, focused, willing to put the collective, that is, the Roman city-state, ahead of their individual preferences. The Romans seemed to enjoy rising to challenges. They got knocked down, but they got up again. They also appeared, as best we can tell from the written records, to take pride in their national achievements. Whatever internal struggles were going on, the Romans always got their act together in time of trouble. Or maybe the Romans were right all along, and maybe they were predestined by Jupiter to rule the entire Mediterranean world. 3. Those funky Etruscans. It would be hard to say that the Romans were ashamed of the Etruscan part of their heritage. It would be hard to say that they consciously tried to block it out or rewrite it. But the Romans didn't do an awful lot to help later generations appreciate or understand the Etruscans, and that is quite a shame. What little we can find out about the ancient Etruscans to this day is very fascinating. On the other hand, the Romans assimilated Etruscan culture so thoroughly and so respectfully that it anticipated how the Romans would react to the Greek Hellenic culture or Hellenistic culture in a couple of centuries. In the 1st century AD, the Emperor Claudius would write a 20-volume history of the ancient Etruscans, which is sadly lost. Although its loss probably reflects more its quality back in the day, it would have been tremendously interesting had it survived, not only for our appreciation of the Etruscans, but for our understanding of Claudius, who himself proudly traced his ancestry back to the Etruscan clan of the Clausii. 4. The Roman national myth. At the beginning of their history, the Romans undoubtedly had to be simple, tough peasants with close ties to their native soil and steeped in the mos maiorum, the way of the elders. The Romans were always dropping the plow and picking up the sword, and then dropping the sword and picking up the plow, that sort of thing. And most of all, they were farmers. To the end of the Republican era, that is exactly how the Romans saw themselves, long after they had become a primarily urban culture. Of course, by that time, the Romans were also hideously wealthy and ruled the Western Mediterranean. Still, Rome's historians saw it as their task to preserve this aura of a simpler time, the simpler time of the mos maiorum, whenever they wrote about Rome's earliest days. Sometimes the tales they tell have little or no historical basis, yet they are very worthwhile for what they tell us about how the Romans saw themselves. After all, it's not as though there's no such thing as an American national myth, however differently you or I might personally interpret it.